All right, this is a quick look at epithelial tissues from big picture anatomy. First, let's take a look at the basic features of epithelial tissues. Don't forget what defines this fundamental kind of organization for cells within your body is that an epithelium or an epithelial tissue is a sheet of cells, a flat sheet of cells that covers or lines either the outside of the body, in the case of, let's say, the skin or the conjunctiva over the eye, or an internal surface inside the body, like the inside of the body cavity or chest or pleural cavity with the serous lining, or the inside of a blood vessel, in the case of the endothelial lining, or the inside of the entire gut tract, or the stomach, intestines, esophagus, the inside of the lungs, the inside of the trachea. So that's the basic purpose and organization of an epithelial tissue. So when we look at this flat sheet of cells, what we see is it has an underlying basal surface that it is sitting on, usually sitting on some other connective tissue, but there's a very thin layer of collagen fibers that we consider part of the epithelial tissue that's called the basement membrane. And that's what all of the cells are sitting on. On the other hand, the cells have an exposed apical surface, which is going to be exposed to whatever's outside, whatever the cell is covering. If it's on the outside of the body, it's going to be exposed to the air. If it's inside the gut tract, it's going to be exposed to the food and liquids that come in. If it's inside the body cavity, it's going to be exposed to the internal parts of the body cavity. This apical surface can sometimes have some what we call cell appendages or little structures on it, like cilia, in the case of the epithelial lining going down to the lungs through in the trachea and bronchioles, or in the gut, in the intestines, a lot of the apical surface has microvilli to help with absorption of nutrients. Finally, there's going to be a lateral surface, which is that surface between the cells. So if we look at a couple cells close up, we can see that the cells touch each other, and there are some what we call desmosomes, or cell adhesion proteins, at the point where the cells touch each other. And we can have kind of two general types of adhesion surfaces or connections between the cells, what we call tight junctions, which are impermeable epitheliums that tend to prevent anything from getting across the epithelial tissue, and what we call loose junctions, which are very permeable and allow for lots of diffusion. So if it's something, let's say, lining the bladder where you wouldn't want a urine to escape, you would want a tight junction. Whereas if it's lining, let's say, the blood vessels, where you want both oxygen and nutrients to be able to easily diffuse across the epithelial cells, then you would have what we call a loose junction. Okay, continuing on, having taken a look at these overall features of an epithelial tissue, let's take a look at classes or different types of epithelial tissues. In general, we talk about simple epithelial tissues where there's just one single layer of cells, as compared to stratified epithelial tissues where you would have multiple layers of cells that you move down through. In the case of the simple epithelial tissues, we've got simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. The squamous cells are what we call squash. They're flat. They would be something just like the palm of your hands, with all edged up against each other. So you have these very flat cells that tend to allow for easy diffusion of substances across the epithelial tissue. We would find them in the alveoli of the lungs, allowing for oxygen diffusion, in the serosa or epithelial lining of the body cavity, the serous linings, or pleura and peritoneum, and also those endothelial linings of all of the blood vessels, where again nutrients and oxygen are diffusing in and out of the blood vessels. Simple cuboidal epithelial tissues are little rounded, what I sometimes call factory cells, because we almost always find them in glands, where these cuboidal cells surround an inner open space or tubule in the gland, and they secrete a product into that tube. And so they're a very rounded or almost cube-like cell. The simple columnar cells we tend to find in the intestines. They're like columns all lined up against each other, lining the wall of the intestines. The food or nutrients or liquids would be passing through here. They tend to have little microvilli on the surface of the cells, the apical surface, and also a mucus layer with these goblet cells in there. Finally, we would have a weird category that's basically a simple epithelial cell, but we say it's pseudostratified. They tend to be columnar cells with a few basal or stem cells underneath them here that can divide and replace these cells. So it almost looks like they're another layer. We tend to find these cells in the trachea and the bronchioles going down to the lungs. They have little cilia on the surface of the cells, and they are columnar. So we sometimes say it's a columnar ciliated pseudostratified epithelium, pseudostratified for the presence of these basal or stem cells that divide and replace the other cells. Finally, in the stratified category, I'm only going to ask you to look at a couple of these most important ones. The stratified transitional epithelial cells, as you move through from deep to superficial, you have a whole bunch of cells jumbled up on top of each other in anywhere from 2 to 8 layers, and this is a very unique epithelial tissue that we find lining the bladder and the ureter, because what happens is the bladder fills with urine and it stretches out. This almost 8-cell layer thick epithelial tissue can stretch out to just 2 layers, always maintaining on its surface a perfectly impermeable tight junction connection, in part due to these what are called umbrella cells on the surface of the epithelial cells, where in the inside of the bladder where the urine would be located. Finally, we have stratified squamous epithelial tissues. They have squamous cells on the surface. We're basically referring to the skin or anywhere the skin involutes into the body, like in the mouth cavity, in the nasal cavity, in the vagina. And this really needs its own page because this is perhaps the most complex epithelial tissue we have in the body. And so we'll treat with this later. So that's it for epithelial tissues from Big Picture Anatomy.